Because you've always taken such charge.
You are listening
to the Border Chronicle.
Welcome to the Border Chronicle podcast, where we bring news and analysis from the borderlands. I'm Caroline Tracey, a reporter and editor with the Border Chronicle and the author of Salt Lakes and Unnatural History. Today, we're bringing you a conversation with Logan Phillips. Logan is a poet and cultural worker in Tucson, Arizona, who just published a new book called Reckon. Logan's book of poetry explores his relationship to his birthplace of Tombstone, Arizona, a town that has fashioned itself into a hotspot of Old West tourism through themes like masculinity and violence. Logan and I discussed the relationship between poetry, prose, and graphic design, the history of Arizona, and his own personal family background in the region. Now, here is our conversation. This is the Border Chronicle podcast, and I'm here with Logan Phillips, who is a poet and cultural worker in Tucson, Arizona, and we're going to talk about Logan's new book, which is called Reckon. The first thing I want to ask you about, Logan, is Tombstone. Can you tell us, for people who have not visited Tombstone, what is the deal with that town?
What is the deal with Tombstone? That is kind of the question, right? It's a small town in southeastern Arizona, right in the corner, basically between Mexico and New Mexico, what is now Cochise County. And it's a place where my family lived when I was born. We only lived there until I was at about 2, but I grew up on the other side of the San Pedro River from Tombstone, and we frequently visited throughout my childhood and played a big role in the family lore, as it were. So it's a place that has been mythologized beyond belief, really. It's been so wrapped in myth and legend that it's hard to even know what is at the base of all of that. But at its core, it was a boom town in the early 1880s, and is famous for an incident of gun violence that played out there in 1881, and has since been celebrated, with reenactments 3 times a day since at least 1929 or so, 100 years almost. And, being gendered as male, raised in this place, the book is a lot about dealing not only with that history, but with my family's history and how the two intersect.
Yeah, when you visit Tombstone, I've only visited, I've never lived there, but it's odd because it feels like, this kind of reenacted town, this town that's living out the fantasy.
Yeah, very much so. It was a real place and continues to be a real place, but there was a real investment, in the 1980s and early 90s in really doubling down on what some people have called the Disneyfication of the place, right? The power lines were actually buried underground, and the pavement of the street was ripped up, and there was an effort made to return the look of Allen Street, the most famous street in particular, to a certain idea of history, a certain idea of the historic moment.
That's super interesting. And how was it that your family ended up there and you came to be born there?
Just one of those things, how life plays out. My parents were living in Tucson, and I would have been born and raised here in Tucson, where I now live. But my dad was a park ranger at Saguaro, what was then Saguaro Monument. And it was an era in which the Park Service was undergoing a transformation into more of a law enforcement agency. And he was asked to start carrying a gun and, make traffic stops and these sort of things. And that's not what he was interested in and joined for. And so he went for a promotion, didn't get it, and ended up looking for a career change into the state parks system. And so, as he tells it, it was either going to be living in a single wide trailer on an acre of asphalt under the Superstition Mountains, or it was going to be moving to small town Tombstone to work as a state parks ranger in the Historic Courthouse State Park.
Gotcha.
So that's where we were.
That's interesting. That's kind of a moment of the history of national park rangers that we don't really think about nowadays. I don't think anyone thinks about them so much as, I mean, maybe people do as an enforcement agency, but it does kind of make sense that that happened. Um, my understanding is you have a background as a spoken word poet, so maybe you could tell us about that. But another thing that really struck me about your book was how visual it is. I loved the graphic element of it, and I was wondering if you could talk about how those elements kind of came together, the poetry and the visual elements.
Sure. Yeah, I've written poetry basically my whole life, but never really found community or a way that poetry could interact with, the real world, real life, until I became involved in the poetry slam movement in the early 2000s in northern Arizona. And there it was a real crash course in how self-expression is more than just self-expression, and how a voice interacts with community, not only speaking, but also listening. Some of the most diverse rooms I'd ever been in my life up to that point were at poetry slams. And so I learned through that way the possibilities of poetry. And so I've always been interested, not in kind of a dichotomy between poetry on the page and poetry in the stage, but very interested in the possibilities of each. So, when it comes to being in a real room with real people in real time, there's an energetic flow that happens, right? And there's a sound that one can emphasize with the words themselves that's always been really interesting to me, very alive. And when it comes to the page, there's things you can do on the page that you couldn't do on the stage, and one of those things is visuals. And so this project was different for me in that I gave up writing in Microsoft Word and switched to Adobe InDesign, which is basically like Photoshop but for layout. And it is, if anyone's ever tried to drop a photo into Microsoft Word and lay it out, you know what a nightmare that can be. And InDesign is just very flexible. And so I began writing with images and against images, and in some cases literally through or over the image. And that allowed me to start thinking through the visuals of a place, because Tombstone has been the basis for endless TV shows and movies and, visual fantasy, cowboy culture writ large. And so, of course, image, literally and metaphorically, is a central part of the place where I'm from. And so bringing in things like newspaper articles, stills from movies that my uncle has been in. My uncle is a Hollywood actor and worked as a stuntman at old Tucson studios. Things like that wanted to be in the poems. And I was interested in how text could be more than just the words on the page.
Yeah, that reminds me, when I was a kid, my mom was taking classes to like graphic design classes. And so I learned to word process in Adobe Illustrator, which is a nightmare. Like it's so hard.
Yeah.
I didn't know that Word existed and that it could be so easy to process words. So I sort of had the reverse experience when I was learning to write.
Nice.
I guess another page stage dichotomy, but within the page that this book made me wonder about was there are moments when it's very poetic and moments when it really shifts into something kind of more essayistic, I guess. And I was curious how you kind of how do you shift between those two types of writing?
Yeah, it's a good question, and one that I think I was trying to figure out myself when writing it. I really was not interested in predetermining the outcome. I think previously in my first book, Sonoran Strange, that came out in 2015, I had an idea of what the poems wanted to do before I wrote them. And so it was writing like towards an answer in some cases, maybe. And in this book, it was really about writing the questions and really about not knowing. And so in that not knowing, I became very genre agnostic and kind of let the piece decide for itself if it wanted to use line breaks or if it was doing the forbidden thing for a poet, which is using paragraphs, very experimental, right? But genre itself is also part of the ways that we frame history, right? When we take complex human contradictory history and try to fit it into a Hollywood movie plot, there's going to be things that are left out inherently in that, and other parts that are emphasized, and likewise with a newspaper article, likewise with any a postcard version of a place. And so I wanted to cast these histories of my family, myself, my relationship to place, Tombstone itself, through the lenses of these different genres, and see what different things would pan out, as it were.
Yeah. Speaking of, you mentioned sort of the questions of the book, and I think that when I was, a college student and studying literature, one of the things that was helpful for me that someone told me about reading poetry is often a book of poetry has sort of one central question it's trying to work out, or maybe a series of interconnected questions, but it's coherent often in that way. And I wanted to ask you, sort of, was there a question that you were trying to figure out while you were working on this?
Oh, I mean, so many, really. But it's an interconnected set of questions that, like any good question, kind of morphs and changes the way that you look, depending on the day that you're looking at it, or the news of the day. Frankly, for me, it's a lot about memory and how we construct our identities retrospectively, right? We look back and construct a cause and effect chain of events that led us to where we are today. But of course, in the moment, it's chaotic. We have no idea how things could lead to the way they do. And this is paralleled in things like, historicizing a gunfight and taking what was a random 15-second moment of male gun violence and historicizing it and, turning it into symbol, and kind of playing that out for meaning across the centuries, really. And of course, I'm not here to say that's right or wrong. I'm just here to say that, similar to how we were just talking about genres, there's going to be limits and advantages to doing that. And so I guess the questions are around inheritance, right? Being of a family that's Irish, Slavic inheritance, ancestry, coming from coal miners and ranchers and people who ran hotels and teachers. I'm interested in how story is told, how identity is passed, how one family's immigrant experience after being displaced in Ireland becomes another family's experience being displaced by the original family, and how these cycles of myth-making, whiteness, nationhood kind of play out all at the same time and in such a cyclical way. Right. And so I know it's cliche to say the personal is political, but really thinking about the intersections of identity and nationhood, especially in times like these, especially being raised on the U.S.-Mexico border, is something that is overdue, I think, to think about. And I'm glad to see that, many others are also kind of following this vein, I guess, as well as, hopefully this book is doing that too. Yeah.
Would you say that I guess I'm sort of curious about your relationship over time to the mythology of Tombstone. Like, would you say, I got the sense in the book that you had to kind of work your way out of the cowboy myth, and I was curious, what that process was like for you.
This was the last book I ever wanted to write. I never set out to write a book about cowboys or about the West or about, mythologies or gunfights. In a lot of ways, being raised in rural Arizona in the 1980s and 90s, pre-internet mainly, definitely pre-YouTube, pre-podcasts, Napster was the kind of last thing that happened before I left home when we finally got access to the world of music, And so we forget now what that was like. It feels like it might as well have been 1880 or 1990, 1980, 1890. It's like all these becomes becomes kind of interchangeable when you look back at what photos looked like in 1992, you know, what the fidelity of video was. When you watch a basketball replay from 2000, it looks like, you know, what era is that from? And so I'm thinking about how formats change and how our relationship to place changes as well. My arts practice at that time, being raised rural, was a lot about getting the hell out of there, right? There wasn't poetry around very much when I was a kid. There was cowboy poetry, but I didn't really see myself in that. And I wanted the rest of the world. I wanted to know a place where, you know, gender roles weren't so fixed, where queerness wasn't something that was hidden, where there was just a much wider view to be able to be taken of the world. And so writing and poetry became a way to get at that and get away from where I was from. But I think we reach a certain point in our lives, and for me it was, especially after becoming a parent myself and thinking about inheritance, that we either deal with where we came from or we spend the rest of our lives running from it. And for me, this book became the chance to really think through all of the complexities of where I'm from and those contradictions that are very uncomfortable and that I may not identify with or agree with, but are part of my cultural makeup. And that friction of those contradictions is a form of energy, is a form of heat. And I'm trying to lean into that.
Yeah, it resonated with me because I didn't grow up in Arizona, but I grew up in Colorado, and certainly sort of the romance of the West and ranching was something that I was really steeped in. You know, the way that my grandparents sort of talked about their childhoods. My grandmother had grown up in Denver. My grandfather had grown up on a ranch, and like it was just this very powerful sort of like longing that I feel like definitely got impregnated in me. And so even, you know, sort of the more you study the Southwest, it's like the romance is still there, and sort of like I think I've had to sort of tell myself it's okay that it can just be there, even though, you know, you sort of like study your way out of it.
That's right, and recognizing that, you know, there is something really beautiful about that love, because it is a relationship to the land. Mm-hmm. And it is a love of the land. And being in relationship with land and with others and with the more than human world and with the water and with the air is something that is deeply beautiful, and in many ways is exactly what we need right now, right? You know, unfortunately, that love intersects with colonialism and displacement and indigenous genocide and you know, the market forces of capitalism extracting wealth from the earth and destroying the earth and those relationships in the process. And so how we hold both those things at the same time is a work that is ongoing, and I think has serious political ramifications in our individual lives, and certainly collectively in a country that has never ever reckoned with its past or even had the willpower to think through where it came from and what it stands for, in fact, not in ideal.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree. This book, I'm going to hold up something because this is a visual podcast. This book reminded me a lot of a book I really like. I don't know if you know this book called You Animal Machine.
I don't.
It reminded me so much because it's a book of poetry that has a lot of visual elements. I'm just holding it up for your benefit.
I'm writing it down right now.
Okay, great. But that made me want to ask you, what sort of things you were reading and what other maybe non-reading influences you had on this book.
Well, while we're holding up books, and I'm right next to my bookshelf here, this book is Wisconsin Death Trip.
Oh, cool, yeah.
This is 1971. Really interesting project of kind of archival digging and newspaper sampling and a newspaper archive that was on the verge of being completely lost, and a lot of like outtakes and just strangeness that really, for me, helped me think through the archive and other ways of engaging with it that weren't like, you know, trying to do this sort of research that's like combat, where you're trying to like justify what your position and destroy someone else's interpretation of history, but instead getting into kind of more of the subtle energies of things. So there's that one. Then, there's books of a previous generation, like Edward Dorn's work. Gunslinger was a big one for me, kind of taking the idea of the West and these myths and using them for something completely different, as well as just the books that were on my shelf as a kid. My dad working in museums throughout my childhood. Neither of my parents identify as academics, and neither of them identify actually as artists, but I think of them both as being very artistic and being not, if not intellectual, certainly well read and well considered, and in a way that is very unpretentious and kind of not credentialed or whatever, but that sort of working class relationship to knowledge had books on the Chiricahua Apache that were on my bookshelf. And that's why I'm so honored that my book is out on University of Arizona Press, because so many of University of Arizona Press books were those that I was looking through at 10, 12, 14 years old.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because the Courthouse Museum does figure into the book, can you talk a little bit about sort of, I guess, the type of work that your dad did there and the type of way that, I guess, his work presented history to the public?
Sure. He was a curator at the museum where he ended up. And in History Museum, we think of curator as art museum, as someone who kind of puts together shows and chooses things. But in the History Museum sense, it's more about how historical information is portrayed and presented literally in the construction of exhibits. And so, my dad was young, he was a go-getter, and he had a forestry degree, and ended up working at this courthouse museum in Tombstone, and was just kind of jack of all trades, doing probably a little bit of everything, getting called in the middle of the night when a bat had broken in through the top window and was flying around the museum, and he had to get it out at 3 a.m. or whatever. There are these stories he tells. But he really began having an affinity for laying out artifacts, for laying out type and putting together exhibits, which wasn't necessarily his job description, come to find out. It was something he kind of took on. And there's a photo in the book that I found at the 11th hour before I turned in the manuscript that was just like, thank God that it came to me when it did. But it's actually of him taking a photo of an exhibit that he had designed in the Tombstone Courthouse Museum, and it's a exhibit that has glass in the front, and so we see the exhibit, but then we also see his reflection taking the photo, and he was taking that photo to submit it for a new job application at the Fort Huachuca Museum, which is a military history museum where he ended up working, and the reason we moved away from Tombstone, he ended up working there for the rest of his career. And that is a whole other set of lessons and stories, because that history is the history told in the Fort Huachuca Museum is the history of U.S. colonial conquest of what is now called the Southwest, and really the function of fortifying and securing the border and finishing the indigenous genocide of the United States, or putting down the last remnants of armed resistance, certainly in the form of the Chiricahua Apache. And so he wasn't writing the history, but he was presenting the history. And so that also, as a poet and as an artist, reminds me of the ways that I am bringing in history into the book. And so that's one of the reasons that one of the sections of the book is the Courthouse Museum, and the poems take the form of exhibits, because that's a way to think through relating to history again. Yeah,
that's interesting. You brought the military history up, because one thing that I was thinking, I'm working on another post for the Border Chronicle about a book that's coming out. I don't know if you've seen this book called Now I Surrender, but it's about the Apache Wars. and they go to Tombstone. The characters go to Tombstone on their like road trip to research the Apache Wars. And the author is Mexican, so his family lives in the U.S., but they're sort of Mexican American, and one of their remarks about Tombstone is that like all the impersonators are white, but the whole public is very diverse, much more diverse than the people who are playing the roles. But it made me think about how one of the really striking things I think about sort of driving around southern Arizona today and then reading about it is you realize that sort of all this very beautiful country was a war zone. And I thought your book did a really nice job of sort of connecting that to violence of today, the type of sort of masculine gun violence, like you said.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. It's not something that we realize today, that the location of the U.S.-Mexico border, apart from having moved many times, was finally decided in large place due to the agency and will of the Apache people, right? The reason that even the Constitutional Congress of Arizona was 100% Anglo and the Constitutional Congress of New Mexico was 100% Hispanic has everything to do with successful indigenous resistance, right? That continues up into this day. And that's not the way the Apache Wars are certainly talked about at the Fort Huachuca Museum, but is the material fact of this place. And so we see that, when thinking through these relationships between violence and the beauty of this place, then that juxtaposition has always fascinated me. But even thinking through, contradictions like the Buffalo Soldiers, right, who were formerly enslaved men, doing the best that they could, taking one of the only paths available, especially after the destruction of Black Reconstruction, to advance themselves and their families, right? And what was that advancement offered to them but the violence against indigenous people, right? And so I think, look no farther than, the men who were involved in the shooting of Alex Preddy, right, who were both Mexican American or Hispanic or Latino. And we see that devil's bargain is still constantly offered within this system, right? That even getting ahead in this system means turning around and exploiting or harming someone else. And so those cycles of boom and bust and exploitation and conquest just continue.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the sort of idea that you become an American by helping secure the border. And I mean, that was true on the Mexican side too, right? There were indigenous Mexicans that supported the government in fighting against the Apache that, were becoming Mexican by turning on indigenous people as well. Well, I guess, now that we've talked about the Courthouse Museum, maybe could you read us a few of those poems?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. So while we're pulling out books, this is the book. And I'm so grateful for to the press for being, interested in doing something that is so visual. Shout out to them, because most presses, poetry presses in particular, there's one photo and that's a little extreme for them. So very cool that they were interested in doing this. And, this section is a section that I don't often read from without the contextualization of why they are exhibits. And so I'm happy to do that in this conversation. So the first two I'll read are we'll just go with these. Exhibit. History is an old theater turned museum turned replica desert evening, where Kid Me steps on a hidden switch and a coyote calls from a tape loop. Then history auto rewinds, unseen, beneath a fiberglass boulder. Backstage in the archive, history is just what Dad did. Taught himself to build exhibits, how to spell letter by letter the text given to him. Taxonomy, taxidermy. Hawk, skunk, rattlesnake den. Who won, what war, when. History is not what happened, but how it is told on Take Your Son to Work Day. Here's another one. Exhibit. This dry, lush land, cared for over millennia of lifetimes by the Atum and ancestors, grass grown tall in story and culture. Cattle arrived, then the train. Cowboys didn't own the cows they spent their lives working. Cattle, the technology by which this land's wide richness was ingested, extracted into private profit for stock owners, stockholders. Grasslands turned meat, shipped east from railhead at Benson. It's not the cow's fault. Land turned hard scrabble shale, scrub creosote ocotillo gray. Land turned range, ground into hamburger, a stakeout, still bleeding. Cattle, 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 cattle. This isn't blaming. This is telling what happened, to who, where, when. Somebody ate a burger in 1883. This land became some body, energy for factory work, until they died, and this land was buried in a coffin if one could be afforded. But don't worry. This was a long time ago, and nothing stays dead long. So now this land is everywhere, again in my dusty inhale, now exhaled in the stories I tell, the work I do, or choose not to.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for asking.
And I guess, let's see, this podcast, I believe, will air early next week. So maybe could you explain the events that you're going to have in Busy and Tempe?
Yeah, for sure. I would love to. It's really important to me to return to rural areas and help produce events in rural areas. Growing up rural, I knew how uncommon that was. So Bisbee at the Central School Project on the 21st, that's a Saturday, 6:30 p.m. It'll actually be a double event together with my good friend Raquel Gutierrez, who has a beautiful book out called Southwest Reconstruction that just came out on Noemi Press. And so it'll be kind of a double feature, double book launch for our two books. And I'm really interested to see how the conversation between the two takes place. Then on February 25th, which is a Wednesday, I'm going to be at Changing Hands Bookstore in Tempe, Arizona. And that will be in conversation with Mary Stevens of Border Arte, who's a fabulous cultural worker and event producer in Arizona. And so there'll be a reading, and then that one will take more of the form of a discussion afterwards as well.
Wonderful. Great. Well, congratulations on the new book. And yeah, I think that it'll be of interest to the Border Chronicle readers and listeners and watchers on YouTube. So yeah, thank you.
Well, thanks so much for your work. I'm a regular listener of the podcast and appreciate the work that you all have done. It's really, really important in, historically and currently, what happens at the border, as Todd Miller says, doesn't stay at the border and moves throughout and really becomes a microcosm of not only the violence and, surveillance technologies and these sort of things, but also the forms of resilience and intercultural work that certainly raised me and made me who I am, but I think really can serve as a lesson for folks everywhere.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that does it for this episode. That was Logan Phillips, and his new book is called Reckon. This episode was edited by Jose Olivares. If you like what you're hearing, please consider rating us on your favorite podcast platform because it helps other people find the show. You can check out more of our work at theborderchronicle.com. And in fact, we have a brand new website, so please do check us out. I'm Caroline Tracey, and this is the Border Chronicle podcast. See you next time.
Because you've always taken such charge.
Llegó justo antes del aguacero. You are listening
to the Border Chronicle.